Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our conversations with the poetry of Emily Dickinson as we are reading them from the Johnson edition. We now turn to poem number 79, Going to Heaven, I Don't Know When. I find this poem truly a remarkable poem, especially where it sits. Notice now we're coming up on the 80th poem, and this is another journey poem. It's another poem of afterlife. It's another poem that takes us back to poem 70, and our assumptions are that you've been working with us now at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, our playlist is called Chats with Emily, and I'm hopeful that not only did you expose yourself to that introductory set of comments, I'm really hopeful that you have worked now through the previous 78 poems. We just finished with A Poor Torn Heart, and the way in which you're starting to see a certain kind of continuity of ideas. My Emily group is reporting that now, as they are working through the first 100 of these poems in the Johnson edition, that there's a certain kind of, they call it a lack of stress on getting the interpretation right, and more about experiencing what Emily is clearly doing, which is why we call this series Chats with Emily. I want there to be a certain kind of chat-like experience where we come to these poems and we say, what are the many possibilities of interpretation? And I'm excited to work now this set of lines with you. But go back and look at poem 70 and just read that poem again. We won't do it here, but I would recommend very much that you do that. Now, just to remind, Emily was very influenced by Reverend Wadsworth and the Dr. Wadsworth, and his apocalyptic vision, as Wisher will certainly talk about it, the great biographer of Emily. This Was a Poet is his classic biography, and I have already recommended it to you to go and run it to ground. It's a wonderful read. Emily's favorite book in the Bible was the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John. And in that regards, she's a skeptic, but she's very much curious about this question of eschatology, the end times and all of that. That is to say, post-death, what's going on. So this poem will play that game. And of course, we're going to begin with the Odyssey and the idea of Plato's Phaedo and the idea of going to heaven. Let's enjoy the poem. Going to heaven, I don't know when. Pray do not ask me how. Indeed, I'm too astonished to think of answering you. Going to heaven, how dim it sounds, and yet it will be done, as sure as flocks go home at night under the shepherd's arm. Perhaps you're going to. Who knows? If you should get there first, save a little space for me, close to the two I lost. The smallest robe will fit me, and just a bit of crown. For you know we do not mind our dress when we are going home. I'm glad I don't believe it, for it would stop my breath, and I'd like to look a little more at such a curious earth. I'm glad they did believe it, whom I have never found since the mighty autumn afternoon. I left them in the ground. Now, the voice here is just brilliant. I mean, this is one of those poems where we just marvel at the way Emily is able to play games with such serious content. Notice the poem is divided into a trinity. Notice we begin with the idea of the journey, or going to heaven. Notice that she'll end the first line with an exclamation point. Notice all the exclamation points to follow, which will again aid in this whole project of her voice. And then the fallibilist position, back to our introductory set of lectures with our big five, epistemological fallibilism is the first of the epistemological position of fallibilism. We say, what? I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's her obvious joy with the word perhaps, the first word of the second one. Notice she'll say it, I don't know. By the way, in poems 127 and poem 696, we'll get this I don't know used two more times. I'm not sure, in other words. She says, I don't know when, but then she'll use the word pray, which is their other word for please. Do not ask me how. In other words, I don't even want to speculate how specifically I'm going to go. Of course, we've already commented on the actual way that Emily will, in fact, go with the tragedy of her illness, right? Indeed, it's almost as if now she's rethinking it. I'm too astonished to think of answering you. She will say a little bit later that from astonishment to stopping one's breath. She says, I can't answer you. And of course, who is the you that she's talking to? It's always going to be fun when she drops these kinds of words. And like, you, who? We're going to come back to it in the second stanza with you're going to. She says, to think of answering you, and then she'll say it again. It's going to heaven. So notice the repetition. How dim is an interesting word. How dim it sounds. Now, dim, of course, has a certain kind of light associated with it. We immediately think of Plato's Republic 7 and the idea of living in the dark cave and then, of course, coming into the light of the sun, blinded by the light and all of that. How dim it sounds. Dim can also mean silly. Dim can also mean dumb, right? How dim it sounds, and yet it will be done, as sure as flocks go home at night into the shepherd's arm. Now, we got to point out, guys, Emily's audience will read this line so much different than many of us because we are not so steeped in biblical language, okay? Emily's audience would immediately understand that she's playing games with the Matthew 6:10 passage, thy will be done in the Lord's Prayer. Notice it's, and yet it will be done, not thy will be done, but it will be done. What will be done? Well, death, right? As sure as flocks go home, we're back to flight theme, at night into the shepherd's arm. Notice it's the shepherd's arm, which is, of course, the reference to Christianity and Christ as the shepherd, right? The good shepherd. Then we'll come to the word perhaps. And again, I told you to go back and read poem 70 to see her use of this word. When we get to poem 696, as I've already said, we're going to get that famous line, acres of perhaps. And if there's one line that qualifies a whole lot of the poems we're reading, it is this notion of acres of perhaps, right? Who's to say, perhaps you're going to, exclamation point. And then, who knows? Now this who knows is wonderful, and it makes us think, of course, of Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass. It's amazing that the two of them are contemporaries that never knew each other or their poetry. Who knows? We're going to get this several times. Poem 58, poem 191. I'll give the line from poem 453 if you're looking at that one. Love, thou art high, I cannot climb thee, but were it two, who knows but we, taking turns. And then in poem 867, we'll have this who knows. And then finally in poem 1394, I love her use of it here, whose pink career may have a close, portentous as our own, who knows, to imitate these neighbors fleet, in all and innocent were me. This idea of, I'm not sure, and I'm going to guess you're not sure either. Perhaps you're going to. Who knows? If you should get there first. And again, the tone here is, it's majestic, right? In other words, I don't know where I'm going after. I don't know what you're going to... But if you go first, right? Whoever the you is here, right? If you should get there first, save just a little space for me. Notice again, back to this idea that Emily will see herself as small, as frail, as a little girl, as a child, little. Save a little space for me. In other words, I'm so little I don't need much space in heaven. Obviously the ironies abound here. Close, she says, save a little space, close to the two I lost. Now, who are these two? Well, some have pointed out that maybe poem 49 will tell us a little bit more about who those two are. Go back and look at that poem. And then she'll start using again religious language from her favorite book, Revelation. She'll say, the smallest robe. In other words, I don't need a large robe because I'm so small. Think about Emily and the way that she dressed in her singular dress, as we commented in her biographic information at the beginning of these lectures. The smallest robe will take us to Revelation 7:9. Will fit me, and just a bit of crown. Of course, Revelation 2:10, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Notice she says, I don't need a big crown because I'm a little person, right? For you know, back to the you again, you know we do not mind our dress when we are going home. So notice, flocks go home, now we go home, going to heaven. In other words, we're not going to care about our dress. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of Pauline theology at play here as well, taking us back to 1 Corinthians 15 in an earlier poem as well. And then, of course, the third stanza, where she starts to really play the theological game of epistemology and what it is that we can actually know and believe. She says, I'm glad I don't believe it. Notice her use of the pronoun it and the vague antecedent. It, what? Like going home or heaven or whatever else it is that she's been including in this poem. I'm glad I don't believe it. For it would stop my breath. So we go from too astonished to, if I were really able to comprehend or understand what really happens in an afterlife, or the apocalyptic vision that she maybe borrows from Wordsworth, she says, it would take my breath. Note the irony. You don't have any breath once you die and you're gone. Right? I love the ironies here. It would stop my breath. And I'd like to look a little more at such a curious earth. In other words, I'm not ready to leave. I'm not ready to go. I'm not ready to go home. I'm not ready to go to heaven. I'm happy that my disbelief allows me to stay alive so that I can enjoy this curious earth. Now, there's so many ways she uses the word curious, and I'll let you run all of those. And I won't mention all of them, but I will mention poem 1203. The past is such a curious creature, she'll say. Just study the way she uses this word curious, and I think it's a central word. I think I said this in an earlier lecture. To me, that's one of the central words of our study of Emily, because what is she if she's not curious, right? She's constantly playing with curiosity. She says it finally this way. You notice earth with an exclamation point. We'll obviously get to ground in the very last word of the poem, right? I'm glad they did believe it. Notice we go from you to me to they, whoever the they is. Maybe it's the two that she lost already. I'm glad they did believe it. And again, what is the it? Maybe the idea of heaven, right? Whom I have never found. She's always looking for answers, she says. I've never found since the mighty autumn afternoon. And again, notice the capitalization of autumn. And this is like, oh yeah, she's been using this, the idea of autumn and fall and all of that as being symbolic of death. Notice the autumn afternoon, I left them in the ground. Yeah, obviously, versus going to heaven, we buried them. And she says, I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of, since we put them in the ground, I got no idea where they are. And so all of a sudden this poem starts to be, wait a minute, is this Emily a skeptic? Is that what we're looking at here? It's a brilliant, brilliant poem in this regards. At 2a, what are we going to do with messages here? I think that she's going to argue in this poem that afterlife and the question of afterlife is a curious topic, but for Emily, it's not so curious that she really right now wants to go find out. She's ready not to leave this earth yet. She'd like to stay here a little bit longer. You remember what Frost said in his poem Birches? We gave full lectures at Lernstrong.net. Remember he says, I'm ready to go swing in a birch and go bye-bye, but not too soon. He says, this is the only place where I can imagine where love actually happens. At 2b, I love the tone, but I want to ask you, is this playful for you? Or is this more sarcastic and therefore a little bit more nasty-edged? This is the thing that makes Emily so brilliant, is it's not always clear what kind of tone we're supposed to read here. At 3a, well, I'll take you to poem 193. We're going to come back to this one later. And she'll say it this way: I shall know why when time is over, and I have ceased to wonder why. Christ will explain each separate anguish in the fair schoolroom of the sky. He will tell me what Peter promised, and I, for wonder it is all, I shall forget the drop of anguish that scalds me now, It's one of the more remarkable poems Emily ever wrote. And we'll certainly come back to this poem when we do that. Of course, I'm thinking of Dante's Divine Commedia and the way in which Dante the Pilgrim is trying to work through the very idea that you don't actually go to hell but through it. And on the other side is what? Well, beyond purgatory, paradise, right? I love to think about the dance between Emily and Walt, which is why we left those talks with Walt, as we called all of our lectures on every poem of Leaves of Grass, the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, to then come to these chats with Emily. Remember Walt at the conclusion of Song of Myself 52? He says, if you want to find me, look for me under your boot soles, right? Notice the way in which we'll end here with the ground. Finally at 3b, well, what are your thoughts about this notion of afterlife and rewards in heaven and all of that kind of thing? Are you at all curious, as Emily clearly was curious? I hope that you're curious about Emily's poetry. Thank you.